Morning, everyone. First off, thanks to the Marine Money team for putting all of this together. This is my first Marine Money conference. I'm really excited to be here. I thought before we introduce the panel, I could just start with a question to all of you, because I know we're the last session before coffee, so caffeine's starting to drain off. So let's engage brains here. I'm going to ask you a trivia question. Do you know what the world record is for the world's fastest insurance claim? From the submission of the claim going in to the money landing in the policyholder's account. Anyone want to hazard a guess? The answer is 2 seconds. 2 seconds from the claim going in to the money landing in the claimant's account. And when that happened, it's a company called Lemonade. Unfortunately, they don't do hull and machinery insurance, unfortunately, but they're in the consumer market. When the claim was submitted, 13 algorithms automatically went through, checked the valuation of the goods, checked for fraud, sent wiring instructions, and the money landed in the claimant's account. About $1,000 for a missing Parker coat. So we know that it's theoretically possible to move to a system where we can have financial decisions being made in an entirely automated fashion. And that relies on some level of good quality data, but then using it to create some kind of value. And that's what we really want to discuss this morning. I'm delighted to say we've got an expert panel to discuss it. What I'd like you to do, perhaps panelists, is first we'll just have a quick introduction from each of you. Just give us your background and why you're here today. Guy, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much, Nick. So I work for a company called ShipWatch. We are a third-party data validation and analytics platform. And ostensibly what we aim to do is congregate all of vessel owners and charterers' data into one location, and from there clean it up and use it for any level of analytics that they might require. And obviously at the moment that seems to be a lot around emissions. But yeah, that's what we do at ShipWatch.
Fantastic. Dana?
Hi, my name is Dana Ordana Rodriguez. I work for the Lloyd's Register Maritime Decarbonization Hub. We're a nonprofit organization that really focuses on driving shipping's decarbonization in a safe and sustainable way. We work also quite closely with our adjacent colleagues at the Lloyd's Register Group. And just a quick insight, the way that we were created was actually through the Lloyd's Register Group and the Lloyd's Register Foundation. So we're definitely a research purpose organization, and a bit of my background is mostly on policy. And as of recent, we've started to dive into the topic of accelerating sustainable finance for shipping's decarbonization, given the IMO's ambition to reach net zero. So yeah, that's a bit about me and my organization. It's a pleasure to be here.
Fantastic. Christian?
Is it working? Yes, it is. I'm Christian. Pleasure to be back. I haven't been for a few years. I represent a tech company called Danalec, which is doing turnkey solutions on actually data capturing and is doing voyage optimization, doing monitoring on fleets, etc. I do come from a background also working with capital structures, working as a shipbroker. So super interesting to see what Adam Kent's view is on the future. And I'm also curious to hear what role does data actually play in that. So super keen on this opportunity to be back here. So thank you for that.
Fantastic. Lastly, Michael.
Michael Parker of Citi. I'm here because I don't want to talk about Basel IV. And this topic is key for the industry. It's key for how we created the Poseidon Principles. It's key for all transparency initiatives related to shipping. What the IMO did in April 18 will be looked back upon as one of the most important decisions in the drive to sustainability in the global economy. And so I'm here, I think, really to talk about that, and also more broadly, maybe, as Dana talked about, how financial institutions really need that data and maybe some of the problems we still have to overcome.
Fantastic. I think it makes sense in a panel about data to start by collecting some data from our panel. So what I'd like you to do as a starting point is can we score where we're at today? So if we do a score of 1 to 10, 1 being that ship finance is reliant entirely on gut instinct and there's very little transparency in the marketplace, and 10 being that ship finance has got to a point where decision making is mostly automatic, that there's full transparency about the life cycle of vessels and all of that. From 1 to 10, roughly, where do we think we are? And perhaps just explain your answer. Michael, why don't you kick us off?
Well, it's sort of 5 on the data aspect, but I think what's important, as most people in the room will know, is it's not data that drives making finance decisions. It's a lot of other things around, but obviously high quality data. And then, of course, there's all the data that is less easy to get, which is where banks with KYC sometimes run into problems. What you cannot take away, and I don't think AI will ever be able to replace, is the personal interaction between the borrower and the lender and the decision that's involved in the qualitative aspects. So it can get more than 5, because you can, if you like, say, well, if we start with, I want to do business, maybe you can then get to 10 on the data bit.
Christian?
I think it depends on what data we're talking about, because as Michael is saying, when you go into the credit committee, and I'm by no mean an expert in this, just a layman, I think it's, as you say, the counterpart risk, etc., and those kind of things that you need to look the lender and borrower in the eyes. And there it might be 5. I do, however, think if we talk about emissions reporting, if we talk about having the quality of the data coming from the vessel to shore, we're still seeing that 70% of the fleet is relying on Noon report only, which we know could be faulty. And therefore, I think if that is the data that we're looking into, then we might be lower than 5. But I do think, now we have somebody from Shipwatch, where I know that the banks are doing a lot in assessing the risk. So perhaps 5 is a good number to not to be too pessimistic.
Dana?
I think for me, it would also be around a 5, just from some knowledge from my adjacent colleagues at the Lloyd's Register group. There's been a lot of work from their side in standardizing the way that this data is collected. And I think the fact that as Christian mentioned, the fragmentation that customers get or ship owners get from the Noon reports is actually quite crucial when it comes to other parties utilizing that data in an efficient way. So standardizing the way this data is collected is really important in getting us to the 10-9 aspect of your rating. Just because data is really important, as Michael mentioned, it could be for investment decisions, but I think it also is really important now with all these new regulations, specifically within the EU, a lot of financial regulations, corporate sustainability regulations. So having this standardized data set that is easily accessible to non-data experts is quite crucial to get us to that point where we're not looking at archaic data, but actually more modern, synthesized, easily accessible data. So yeah, I would also agree with Michael and Christian in the sense that we're probably in the middle between 5 and 6, but I think shooting at 10 is still viable with these new standardized approaches and regulations.
Awesome. Guy?
Yeah, I think Christian's pretty spot on in terms of the technology that is available to ship owners. Granted, it might be quite expensive. That would put us far more into kind of a 7, 8 level of data gathering, collection, understanding, and the multitude of kind of benefits that sensors provide. But generally, ships do not sail with sensors on board, or if they do, they are uncalibrated. So we have to look at the baseline industry standard, which is still Noon data. And if we look at that, there's significant challenges from collecting data to the lack of uniformity in the emissions regulations, in the classification societies and the way they're set up. And then also the challenge of transparency, or rather the lack of transparency. So yeah, I would say actually when it comes to position report data, it's archaic, and probably you're looking at a 3 or a 4 on that scale, but the capabilities and the innovation is there. We just need to give it a bit more time, I guess, and keep tweaking it, and hopefully it'll get a bit cheaper as well.
Staying with you then, Guy, why do you think there's that gap between the technological capability being a 7 or an 8, and then the reality of Noon reporting today being a 3 to a 4? Why is that gap not closer together?
Yeah, I mean, ostensibly, sensors are great, but not everyone can afford them, right? I mean, yeah, obviously the biggest players can. And then there's even issues with that in terms of making sure they're calibrated, making sure the data is understood on the shore side. I mean, it provides so much that unless you have a team of skilled analysts to kind of input it and create a logical output for the chartering team or the operations team, it's really rather redundant having them on board. So that's the challenge with sensor data. With position report data, there's three big headaches at the moment. And the first one being collection of data. And by that, I simply mean just the manual inputting from the ships, right? And it's not just one report they're filling out each day. They're reporting 3, 4, 5, 6, depending on how many people in the chain. We can improve that, and at Shipwatch we do. So we build customizable noon reports, or we can build a ream of validations that allow us to know when the data looks to be inaccurate and not reflective of what's happening on board. But at the very core, it's changing the mindset on board the ship, right? These ships have been able to submit data for years without any of us really paying that much attention. And now suddenly we're kind of watching them and picking them up on all their mistakes. So what we do is we decide to say, okay, let's tell them what fields they've incorrectly inputted, how we think or shoreside they could correct it. But then also the most important is to why we're asking this of them. And I can tell you, we've got about 40 plus technical managers on our system. And over a 12-month period, just by regular feedback with the captains, keeping an open communication loop, we've seen about a 70 to 75% reduction in simple inputting errors. Okay, so I think there just needs to be that continual loop of communication with the ship. The second biggest challenge and headache to owners is, as Christian alluded to, the uniformity aspect and the lack of. I mean, there's no doubt emissions regulation has brought about the ability for us to take better care of our data. But even if you look at the various regulations, EU ETS looks at fuel quantity, Fuel EU looks at the energy output, CII looks at the utilization of your ships. All these require different data sets, okay? And on top of that, vast numbers of calculations. Now, if you're not a big owner with a big analytical team, it's very difficult for you to assign operators and tech managers to do all of this work throughout the year. I mean, what we see, a lot of these guys leave it to the end of the year, and I can tell you from experience, it's a huge challenge. And then the final thing is transparency, or as I said, rather lack of. What we see at Shipwatch is owners still relatively reluctant to share information with the charterers. They're relying on contract clauses to avoid claims instead of promoting efficiency and transparency. Obviously, Sea Cargo Charter is an initiative that invites greater transparency through the chartering chain. But again, it has its flaws. Charterers are only accessing one snippet of data that they get from the ship. They don't have the back data. They don't have the more granular data. So how do they validate that? Well, thankfully, they outsource it to people like Shipwatch, but it still shows that lack of transparency and the fact that our industry really is rather opaque still. So those are the challenges, and that's why I think there's a
lack of willingness to be transparent. There's a lack of uniformity in how the data is distributed.
Yeah.
And potentially the data is wrong anyway if it's coming off the ship. Christian, what's your view on all of that? How do you see those challenges being overcome?
Yeah, and perhaps not so long an answer to that, but I think we need to think about, we just saw from Adam Kent that it's an aging fleet, right? And we meet a lot of ship owners out there who actually want to do something on having high frequency data and want to have a data lake flowing with data in. But if you have a 22-year-old bulk carrier that you either need to scrap in a few years or resell, are you really willing to make an investment of 200, 300,000 US dollars to get that up to snuff? Or would you rather wait for the next new building to have that ready? I think that's part of the I don't think we should be too hard. We are always telling ourselves that we are laggards in this industry and that we're not doing a lot. I actually think we are, but it takes time, and it's a transformation, both for our industry, but also for all the other industries that needs to be compliant towards a greener world going forward. But we very much welcome partnerships with everybody, and especially the financing and investment community, to sort of say, what can we do in terms of that? Are there any tools in the financing toolbox to assist in that transformation, of course?
Michael, I'd be interested in your view, because you said right at the top there are some really important decisions that need to be made, and that we need to move to this kind of sustainable green financing. But we're hearing that the investment required to get the level of data required to possibly get access to that kind of financing is potentially prohibitive to ship owners. So how can ship owners kind of overcome that gap?
I think all the problems Guy outlined are solvable, and I don't disagree with any of his diagnosis, but I think everything you said, no one would have understood a word that you said 5 years ago. We have come a long, long way, and I think if the IMO does what it says it will do this year, that will accelerate a process. And it's not, it becomes one of, the issue for particularly small ship owners, because it's the cost issue, comes off the table because the choice disappears. I think the choice disappears for really 3 reasons. One is regulation. So if the IMO regulates as it says it will, that will fundamentally change, the context and the environment. That will trigger huge amount of interest and investment from outside the industry. Ships move cargoes. The ships are irrelevant without the cargoes. So the drivers in the industry will be coming primarily from the cargo owners, not the ship owners. They need that data for a number of reasons. One of them is to make commercial decisions as to whose ship to put their cargoes on, for a number of reasons, cost being obviously one, but also, whatever elections may take place in the US, the commercial and industrial world is continued to focus on its environmental footprint. Banking regulators haven't suddenly changed their minds and are not about to change their mind about the importance of climate risk. So what the IMO will do is it will lead to a huge shift, I think, in investment in the data. And so a lot of the problems Guy talks about, I think, will be sort of solved through money, through investment and regulation. And then I think it's one of, if you don't do something, and you may have the choice, as you're suggesting, but you may end up no one wanting to put a cargo on your ship. Because if you cannot provide the data, then you won't meet the requirements. And it could in fact be covenants in loan agreements, it could be your insurance, it could be the charter, or whatever it is. So I think that a lot of these problems will disappear once the regulation changes, because that's going to stimulate external interest in solving some of these problems. And that's where I think the tech industry and AI and all those sort of things will begin to have much bigger play, where the investment decision isn't being made by a ship owner, it's being made by someone else. And one other point I sort of wanted to make is one of the problems which you didn't talk about but is a problem is the issue. A lot of the data is confidential, belongs to the ship owner legally, goes to the IMO database. We get it in the banks because we ask for it under the Poseidon principles. They give it to us because there's no reason not to. But all of this data should get into the public domain at some point. And that, I think, the pressure on that, there's not much the IMO can do about it. The Secretary General is very aware of the issue, but it's not really within the IMO's control until maybe certain other things happen. But as soon as you get live streaming of the data, and that is beginning to happen, then that changes the whole thing. The DCS system becomes effectively an audit. What people will want to make commercial decisions is the live streaming of as much of that data as possible to a dashboard, whether it is banks, insurers, cargo owners, whoever it is. And then the last thing I'll say, I think the cost issue is going to mean that a lot of the smaller ship owners are going to have to outsource all those sort of data type services to either the classification societies or the ship managers, i.e. there will be a huge growth in the analytics industry for shipping, which could come from people already in the value chain. But the risk is if it doesn't come from them, someone will come in from the outside to offer it.
You know what?
Teed up a rep from class.
Oh, sorry, I was going to add just one thing, just because I think, Michael, you brought up some really good points in the sense that regulation and policy will definitely steer the needle in increasing investments. But I also think that right now we're at a stage where there's a lot of innovation in technology. And Christian, maybe I'll pass it to you in a bit. But there's so much low Earth satellite systems. I mean, Starlink and others. So maybe there is an opportunity, going back to the challenges that Guy you presented, there is an opportunity to have private sector, maybe data providers specifically, providing more accurate data when it comes to ship or financiers' inability to access that data. So there is an opportunity to not just rely on regulation, because of course, as we know, regulation could go a positive way, but it could also go a negative way, as we've seen, depending on what your opinions are with the new presidential election. So I think there's always an opportunity for private sector, or in this case, technology developers, to play a key role in this aspect, especially given the innovation piece. So yeah, that's just something I wanted to add, and making sure that we keep that in the back of our minds, and we're not just solely reliant on what the policy landscape will look like in the future.
So you're effectively saying that the likes of SpaceX and low Earth orbit satellites and the potential to live stream data off a ship means that the industry may get ahead of regulation, and you don't need to wait for the IMO to...
I feel like it could. And then Christian, I mean, support me on this if you can, but I've heard, because so a little bit of background, I'm leading this project within our program called Accelerating Sustainable Finance for Shipping Decarbonization. My colleagues and I have spoken to various ship financiers, ship owners, and something that has come up was their interest in making this data available, specifically the IMO data set. And one of the reasons, or some of the questions that I've kind of addressed to them is, where do you get this data if you don't get it directly from the ship owner? And a lot of these individuals rely on proxy data from data providers. But something that was highlighted to me is that this proxy data has a discrepancy between 5 to 20%. And that's actually quite interesting when you have ship financiers or investors making decisions on a proxy data that's not completely accurate. So I don't know, this just got me thinking in the sense of there's so much innovation in the space, or at least in the space of like the Starlink and other low Earth satellite systems. So how can we utilize that to get ahead of what policy will end up dictating? So I just see it more as an opportunity, not so much of a challenge.
On that, Guy, you right at the top, you said about actually cleaning up the data, and there's potential discrepancies in data that's being used that provided by third parties or proxy data. What are the actual steps that need to be taken to go from proxy data that may be inaccurate to genuinely accurate live stream data that could be made available to the finance sector?
So I mean, at a very basic level, what we do and what others do is we create validation rules and logic. Okay, so the data comes in, and we are alerted when a particular field, I think there's on average about 100 fields on any given noon report. And then what we do is we are able to combine that with external data sources. So whether that be weather, whether that be satellite data. And on shore side, we can see, okay, if that alert has been triggered, why has it been triggered? And if we can say, there was a reason why it was triggered, then we can negate it. But if it can't fall into the other data sets that we have provided to us, then we probably go back to the ship and we ask them to correct it. And that's when it comes into the whole mindset change and things like that. But obviously there is problem with those external data sources. You know, AIS is getting more reliable, but it certainly isn't perfect. I would say, we're connected to a number of different AIS providers, and at any given moment, there can be really quite rogue data points. And weather data. Weather data is improving massively. I mean, there's an abundance of different providers out there now at different price points. But yeah, I mean, it all comes into really how much are you willing to invest in the data and the extra bits of supporting evidence that you need. And if you are willing to invest in that in-house or externally using a third-party platform, and it's very easy to clean up this data. It just wouldn't be easy without those tools that are continuously improving.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And in terms of how that operational data, when you get to some level of granularity, how that might actually impact the long-term value of the asset, I'd be interested, Christian, do you have any insight on that? Are these investments, did they actually play out and being worth it in terms of the asset values going forward?
That's a good question. We have to remember that historically, our industry has been sort of a low marginal business. And I know there's been some years where somebody has made a lot of money, but there's also been the years where they haven't. Very much the exit value is driven by the market. What is the market sentiments? And here we're sitting and we're three people advocating, oh, get some quality data on, then everything's going to be fine and dandy. But does it really matter if the market goes up with 30-40% or down with 60% on the LNG market as it has in the last 6 months? I really want to get to a point where we have common, uniform data that is flowing in from the vessels, and it can go to the owners, it can go to the banks. Then we have a little bit of the industry still needs to have some sort of, you need to have a cutting edge as a shipping owner, and then you cannot dispose everything to everybody in the world. We need to fix that as well. But it is very much still the market that is dictating the exit value. But I think if we could get a little bit higher on Michael's 5, on the data quality around that, and especially around the emissions data, I think that's the critical thing that we're looking into this year and going forward, because that will sort of dictate a tiering market of the assets, I think. But I think I would be curious to hear what Michael has to say on this one.
Me too.
Well, I think you're right in a sense. Historically, at least, the volatility in shipping has led to significant peaks and troughs, but usually as a result of overbuilding of ships or undersupply. I think what will change, and that I think will still happen, but I think what will change is what they have in some other industries like aviation, like a license to operate. And that I think will increasingly come into shipping through the operation of ships, that if you don't provide the data, it'll be a port state controller item, i.e. the operations will require you to be providing both the regulatory data, whatever that turns out to be as that will evolve, then what the cargo owner wants in addition, because that will choose whether there's actually a cargo on your ship. So it'll be the earnings of the ship in its lifetime under your ownership that will be more important maybe in some way than the exit value. And also that I think to that extent the exit value may be improved or worsened by the operational track record of the vessel, which I think will become much more transparent. Now we have a thing called the dark fleet out there. We have to assume that at some point that all sort of comes back into the global fleet. But I think it will be more in terms of, and this is where I think banks will be much more interested. If you're lending money based upon the volatility in asset values, you should have gone bust in 2012, and you probably did go bust in 2012. It's about the earnings of the vessel. And that's, I think, where the quality of the data and the application of that data consistently is going to enhance the value of an asset and enhance the earnings of the owner.
And rather than looking at the existing fleet as well, I'd be interested just to know about, for the new build fleet, how you see this kind of interplay with green finance. Is it about more access to capital, or do you see that capital being cheaper to access if you've got the right data collection in place?
I mean, this is very important, and this is why I think data, whatever the IMO does this year, it won't be fully effective until sort of data can catch up with it. And that's, again, why the interest of tech companies, either in or from outside the industry, will become important to the pace of that change. In terms of new ships and so-called green financing, the acceleration of alternative fuels becomes very important if the IMO does what it says it will do, because it will stimulate that. what we have to remember is that shipping is the only industry that has legally verifiable and pretty accurate emissions data. No other industry has that. Others have ways of measuring it, but the IMO, the DCS system, is hugely valuable for the industry. And that's why the industry, when the LCA is approved this year, when a carbon levy or whatever pricing mechanism comes in, depends upon the data being deemed to be reliable and easy to provide. So again, the IMO's regulations will only really work if, in fact, that data is there and can be trusted. And that's also why I think there will be an impetus to make that data as publicly available as possible. But the issue for financing is the capital available? Yes, but is it in the interests of the regulated lenders or even the unregulated lenders like private credit to lend to finance those vessels? And that, I think, will depend upon, one, the environmental data, and two, whether or not the banking regulators get round to providing capital relief for that type of lending. And so far, they haven't. And that, I think, we'll have to see whether in context of a changed political environment, there is less or more pressure to do that. But I think, you'll hear later about Basel IV and Basel III. In parts of the world, banks are being more regulated in terms of capital, whereas we really need to get some form of incentive to provide the capital to stimulate truly green, and that's important, financing of new vessels.
Unfortunately, I feel like this could go on for another hour, but unfortunately, we are actually starting to run short on time. So what I'm going to ask the panel to do is perhaps just give your closing thoughts. Guy, let's start with you, and I think perhaps if we can frame this as anyone here in the audience, if they were to take one thing back into their organization, whether they're a finance institution or a ship owner, what should that thing be, and what would help them go from a 2 or a 3 or a 5 up to an 8 or a 9?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think the easiest way to put it is the banks have made it quite easy for us, thanks to Michael and his work with the Poseidon principles. But their policies, internal policies, and the way they build clean data into their models in terms of the financing and access to financing may differ, but the information that they are requesting is largely uniform. So if the banks can do that, we probably need to look a little bit more inwardly at what we can do to create a bit more uniformity and transparency. I would like to say, though, that it's not all doom and gloom. We are seeing a true desire from owners and other stakeholders to look at data and the output of that data. So, we regularly get asked to run analysis on air lubrication systems or fuel additives or anti-fouling paints. So there is that desire to understand what is coming in, and I think that will probably allow the banks to take us maybe a little bit more seriously. But we do need to unite if we're going to achieve 2050. And that comes from sharing this knowledge, not siloing it in-house, but opening it up to the wider market. And then I think the banks can probably take us a little bit more seriously and potentially offer us more incentives or greater incentives when it comes to green financing and sustainability-linked loans.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dana.
I think for me, it has a lot to do with collaboration and communication. So a little bit of what Guy said in terms of creating that transparency between ship owners and financiers and sharing that type of data. Of course, there's high confidentiality on this data, but I think this type of communication and collaboration is key. One other thing I would say is kind of spread of awareness of the importance that shipping has cross-sectorally. So really trying to create some type of value proposition for shipping, like how important is a shipping portfolio within a bank's portfolio, and making sure that there are incentives from a regulatory perspective, so financial regulators actually paying attention on the importance of shipping, such as to what Michael was saying earlier, providing incentives or support, but also making sure that financial regulators listen to what's going on at the IMO, because the IMO is making sure that the shipping industry is decarbonizing, but to what extent are we seeing regulators kind of listening to that or maybe even being attuned to that? So I would just highly stress the need for collaboration and communication in that regard.
Makes perfect sense. Christian?
Thank you. Closing remark. I think for the ship owners, I just want to say it's not that expensive to get started on that. And it is deriving savings that can go into paying the interest to the banks. So get started on that. I think is one thing. For the rest and the ship managers, etc. I think collaboration, as being mentioned here, is super important. Let's make sure that we have that. And for the financiers and the investors, an open hat here to let's collaborate on that. And I think we have on lending documents, you have approved values using with that. We could have same around the data that is being supplied. And now I'm going to stop here because otherwise Mike won't have time to say anything, I can see.
Michael?
I agree with all those three things, but I'd like to finish by saying when the IMO does, hopefully does in April or in October, the rest of the world will wake up to what this industry does. Now, we saw it with the Ever Given during COVID, you know, the odd flash of a realization things came by ship rather than by white van. And Donald Trump will wake up to find that there is a global tax on shipping emissions, which he either voted for or didn't, but probably wasn't able to stop. And that is going to trigger all sorts of things, which, as you can tell, there are lots of people keen to be transparent and provide that data. Ship owners have traditionally been reluctant to share any information they didn't need to share. And that's a culture that is going to dramatically change. It's already changing, but it will be reinforced by the changes in regulations this year. And then I think it's a case of you have no choice but to provide the data. If the data is there, you'll get asked for it. And that's very irritating if, in fact, you don't trust the person to use the information they're giving for the right purposes. But I think that's where the technology industry and the people who understand the shipping industry will be able to bring those two things together. I think, as Guy put it, we will get greater transparency and that sharing. And this will happen. It has to happen. And I think that, it will spawn a new industry almost, which again will be funded to a large extent by people who are moving the cargoes rather than the ship owners who don't have the money to invest.
Falls on me to do a very brief summary then. I think we are very, very close to a tipping point where the investment in ongoing data collection gets paid off at the point where the IMO comes in and says we have a global pricing mechanism for emissions. And I think that is a both very exciting and also potentially quite a challenging time. And I completely agree with the points of the panel that I think this is going to become a question of license to operate rather than a question of value generated. Please, can we thank our panel, Guy, Dana, Christian and Michael. Thank you all very, very much for listening.